This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Essential supplies have been delivered to thousands of people in the Ukrainian city of Kherson for the first time since the war began, UN humanitarians said on Monday. Aid workers brought food, water, hygiene kits, shelter materials and critical household items, such as bedding, thermal blankets and solar lamps, to more than 6,000 people in the city, which returned to Ukrainian control last Friday after Russian troops withdrew. Russian forces occupied Kherson during the first weeks of the war. UN humanitarian coordinator Denise Brown said the people of Kherson are struggling to meet their basic needs, only adding to the trauma of having endured months of constant bombardments, being forced to flee their homes, and seeing their loved ones being killed or injured. The city faces a shortage of water and electricity, while markets are running low on food and health facilities lack medicines. A steep rise in civilian casualties in Somalia, due largely to attacks by the Al-Shabaab armed group, is exacerbating an already grim human rights and humanitarian situation there, said the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on Monday. The latest figures from the UN show that at least 613 civilians have been killed and 948 injured so far this year, the highest number since 2017 and more than a 30% rise from last year. Improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, have been responsible for most of the casualties, more than 90% attributable to Al-Shabaab. Volker Turk is calling on all parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and to ensure that civilians are protected. A lack of testing facilities and poor access to healthcare are some of the reasons that less than half of people living with diabetes in the African region know that they have the condition. Analysis released on Monday by the World Health Organization, or WHO, shows that a lack of awareness about diabetes raises the risk of severe illness and death. This potentially worsens the situation in the region, which already has the world's highest mortality rates due to the disease. Currently, 24 million adults are living with diabetes in Africa. The figure is projected to rise by 129% to 55 million by 2045. Premature deaths from diabetes in the region stands at 58%, higher than the global average of 48%. In addition, only 1 in 2 people living in Africa with type 1 diabetes has access to insulin treatment. WHO says that the rising prevalence of the disease is a wake-up call to reinforce healthcare, improve diagnosis and access to life-saving diabetes medicines, and prioritise diabetes as a major health challenge. Nikki Chadwick, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Prisoners of war on both sides of the conflict in Ukraine have told UN human rights investigators that they have been subjected to torture and ill-treatment while they were held. Matilda Bogner, head of the UN's monitoring mission in Ukraine, said that over the past few months, her team had interviewed 159 prisoners of war, or POWs, both men and women held by Russia, and 175 male prisoners of war held by Ukraine. Ukrainian POWs have said that they were frequently subjected to prolonged beatings, threats, electric shocks and dog attacks. 9 people are said to have died during such attacks in April this year. Both men and women prisoners reported being subjected to various forms of sexual violence. Russian prisoners of war held by Ukraine told interviewers of summary executions and several cases of torture and ill-treatment. Ms. Bogner said that states must treat all prisoners of war humanely at all times, from the moment they are captured until their release and repatriation. The UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR, is calling for the immediate release of thousands of people who are being held in Iran, arrested for their involvement in peaceful demonstrations, amid an increasingly harsh crackdown by authorities. OHCHR says that as of a week ago, more than 1,000 indictments had been issued against people arrested in relation to protests in Tehran province alone. Hundreds of other indictments have been issued in the rest of the country. On Sunday, an unnamed protester was sentenced to death, having been found guilty of waging war against God and corruption on earth for allegedly damaging public property. At least 9 others have been charged with offences that carry the death penalty. OHCHR is calling on Iranian authorities to immediately impose a moratorium on the death penalty, to refrain from charging capital crimes, and to revoke death sentences issued for crimes not qualifying as the most serious crimes. As the Atlantic hurricane season comes to an end, the World Food Programme WFP is warning that extreme weather is threatening food security in Latin America and the Caribbean, one of the regions most affected by climate-related disasters such as floods, storms, droughts and heat waves. Some 1.3 million people have been affected by hurricanes and floods in the region. In some places, harvests have been totally destroyed, exacerbating the hardship of communities affected by extreme weather events. WFP says that it is working with governments to ensure that food stocks are as secure as possible, with proposed measures including elevating houses and reinforcing buildings and harvests. Stockpiling food is also deemed to be critical. Meanwhile, UN Chief Antonio Guterres has told delegates at the G20 summit in Bali that we are on the way to a raging food catastrophe. Without coordinated action, this year's crisis of affordability may become next year's global food shortage. Nikki Chadwick, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. Without urgent investment in climate mitigation and adaptation, countries in the Sahel risk decades of armed conflict and displacement, exacerbated by rising temperatures, scarcity of resources and food insecurity, the UN has warned in a report published on Wednesday. The report, Moving from Reaction to Action, Anticipating Vulnerability Hotspots in the Sahel, says that left unchecked, the climate emergency will further imperil Sahelian communities as devastating floods, droughts and heat waves decimate access to water, food and livelihoods, and amplify the risk of conflict. This will ultimately force more people to flee their homes. Andrew Harper, Special Advisor for Climate Action with the UN Refugee Agency, says that rising temperatures and extreme weather in the Sahel are worsening armed conflict, which is already destroying livelihoods, disrupting food security and driving displacement. He said only a massive boost in collective climate mitigation and adaptation would help the region change course. Children and young people living in cyclone-prone countries are the focus of a new climate finance initiative launched on Wednesday by the UN Children's Fund UNICEF. The initiative aims to enhance countries' climate resilience and disaster preparedness for children and young people, and to better protect them from the impacts of future climate-related disasters. The Today and Tomorrow Climate Finance Plan covers 8 countries in 4 global cyclone basins: Bangladesh, Comoros, Haiti, Fiji, Madagascar, Mozambique, Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. UNICEF hopes to raise $30 million to support 15 million children, young people and women over an initial 3-year period. The agency says that this population group is particularly vulnerable and is among the most affected by disaster risk and climate change. With the right policies in place, digital technology can give an unprecedented boost to sustainable development, particularly for the poorest countries, the UN Secretary-General has told world leaders at the G20 summit in Bali. Antonio Guterres said that G20 countries can help to ensure that the digital age is safe, inclusive and transformational, urging delegates to support the UN's Global Digital Compact programme. It's designed to outline shared principles for an open, free and secure digital future for all, and is due to be agreed by governments at the 2024 Summit of the Future. The Digital Compact aims to deliver in 3 areas, anchored to human rights: closing the digital divide by connecting women and girls, migrants, rural and indigenous people, protecting free speech, freedom of expression, and the right to online autonomy and privacy, and exploring the potential of data to boost sustainable development. Nikki Chadwick, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has welcomed the renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which had been due to expire on Saturday. More than 11.1 million tonnes of agricultural products, including 4.5 million tonnes of corn and 3.2 million tonnes of wheat, have been shipped as part of the agreement, involving Turkey, Ukraine, Russia and the UN, since it was signed on the 22nd of July. Speaking on Thursday, Mr Guterres said that he was deeply moved and grateful that an agreement had been reached. The UN chief also expressed his deep commitment to remove the remaining obstacles to the unimpeded exports of Russian food and fertilizers, as these remain essential to avoid a food crisis next year. Israel must immediately lift the so-called closed military zone it has imposed on the house of prominent Palestinian human rights defender Issa Amro, UN-appointed independent human rights expert said on Thursday. Israeli occupation forces established the zone around Amro's house at the end of October, a day after he tried to file a police complaint over Israeli settler violence. Amro, who is an internationally respected human rights defender and a civil society leader, regularly receives death threats from settlers and Israeli forces, said the experts. His house in Hebron in the occupied West Bank also serves as a community centre of the Palestinian civil society organisation Youth Against Settlements. The experts said that the house closure raises serious concerns about freedom of association and assembly in the occupied Palestinian territory. They have called on Israel to stop attacks on Palestinian human rights organisations and human rights defenders. Sea surface temperatures and ocean heat in parts of the southwest Pacific are increasing at more than 3 times the global average and harming vital ecosystems, according to a new report from the World Meteorological Organization, or WMO, which says that sea level rise poses an existential threat to low-lying islands and their people. The climate update shows how weather-related disasters are undermining socio-economic development and threatening health, food and water security. It provides a snapshot of climate indicators such as temperatures, sea level rise, ocean heat and acidification, and extreme weather, alongside risks and impacts. In 2021, the region reported 57 natural hazards, 93% of which were floods and storms. Overall, 14.3 million people were directly affected by these disasters, causing total economic damage of $5.7 billion. The report highlights big gaps in observing systems and early warning services in the region, which will be one of the priority target areas of a new UN Early Warnings for All initiative. Nikki Chadwick, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. A negotiated solution to break the deadlock on the distribution of hundreds of thousands of tonnes of Russia-made fertiliser blocked in European ports has been welcomed by the head of UN trade body UNCTAD. The development accompanied the renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative to free up exports from Ukraine, which had been due to expire on Saturday. Rebecca Grinspan said that the solution, which involves the UN World Food Programme, WFP, will see a ship loaded with Russian fertiliser leave from the Netherlands for landlocked Malawi via Mozambique next Monday. More than 11.1 million tonnes of agricultural products have been shipped as part of the agreement since it was signed on the 22nd of July. But 300,000 tonnes of Russian fertiliser have remained stranded in different European ports. Ms Greenspan said that the extension of the initiative is very good news for the world and that this latest solution to distribute fertiliser is an important contribution to solving the food insecurity crisis. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has reiterated its call for a ban on forced returns to eastern provinces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, including asylum seekers who have had their claims rejected. Elizabeth Tan, UNHCR's Director of International Protection, said on Friday that the agency is concerned about a rise in attacks on civilians, including those living in sites for displaced people. She said that states have a legal and moral responsibility to allow those fleeing ongoing conflict to seek safety, be accorded asylum if appropriate, and not to forcibly return refugees. Since the beginning of this year, UNHCR has recorded more than 50,000 violations of civilian rights in DRC, including refugees and internally displaced people. Climate activists and civil society have been subjected to intimidation, harassment and surveillance during the COP27 climate summit in Egypt, UN-appointed independent human rights experts said on Friday. They called for Egypt to end all acts of harassment and intimidation and ensure the safety and full participation of human rights defenders and civil society at COP27 and beyond. Concerns were raised in the run-up to the conference, leading to calls for full and safe participation of civil society actors and human rights defenders without reprisals. However, the experts say that they are deeply concerned by reported acts of harassment and intimidation by Egyptian officials, which have infringed the rights of Egyptian and non-Egyptian human rights and environmental defenders, including their rights to freedom of peaceful assembly, expression and effective participation. The experts say they are in touch with the Egyptian government and the organisers of COP27 about their concerns. Nikki Chadwick, UN News.